Hello, I'm Dario Euraque. I'm from Honduras and I teach Latin American and Caribbean history at Trinity College. I want to thank Suniti Maharaj Best and the Lloyd Best Institute for giving us this opportunity. Also the Institute's different members, employees, and others who have hosted us in the different venues for the convoy. I have very much enjoyed it. This is the second time I've been to Trinidad and Tobago over the last 10 years, and I'm very excited to be here. I want to get right to the point because I think that the next event that's going to follow us, the celebration of Professor Lloyd Best's book and the launching of it here is a very important event, and so I don't want to take up too much time on that. I'm going to be hopefully brief in some remarks that I've prepared in the context of the program of the Common Sense Convois that we were given. If you turn to the page, if you have it near you, where there is a series of statements about the Common Sense Convois, there is a statement which reads as follows: what Caribbean do we want our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to inherit 50 years from now, and what will it take to get from here to there? I'm going to address that question by focusing on 5 of the 10 objectives that are listed here in the program. And I want to address each of those 5 objectives because what my colleague Pablo is going to do once I turn it over to him is present some photographs, some different technologies, some different materials that we feel are ways by which we can address, first of all, that question that is posed in the program and the 5 objectives that we want to emphasize. The first objective, and I'm reading here and I'm quoting, on the agenda for regional action is bridging the historical divide between the various peoples of the Caribbean. That to me is a very important objective. And a central issue that I'd like to pose to you, and this is also in the spirit of Mr. Winston Riley's introduction to this morning, which was that this is a mind jazz, that we should open our minds. What I'm going to urge you to do as we address this first objective in the context of the presentation is that you begin to think of the Caribbean in a different way, in a Caribbean that is not only island-based, that is not only English-speaking, that is a Caribbean beyond what you may be most familiar with. I, for example, came to Trinidad in 2001 and went to Jamaica at the same time because the Caribbean that I'm familiar with is the Caribbean sea seen from Central America. And while there's commonalities, there are also significant differences. And if we're going to think about the Caribbean in 50 years, whether the politics, as I forget your, my colleague, the political scientist, was mentioning, we must understand a Caribbean that is broader, my view is, and our view is, than the island Caribbean. Second objective of the convoy says, to transform the region's educational and communication systems. One of the ways to do that is by using some of the technologies that were mentioned, others that were mentioned very early on, Facebook, for example, the youth at different moments in the convoy have emphasized the need for those of us who are not as young to begin to think about those new technologies and rethinking the objectives of the Caribbean. However, in that objective, it says transforming the region's educational communication systems. At least my sense of this, and we could open it up to a brief conversation, is that when the Caribbean is conceptualized, its educational system and communication system, it remains the island Caribbean. It remains the island Caribbean. Not only that, it also remains the Anglo, the English-speaking Caribbean, and there's legitimacy to that. But our view is that, and we're prepared to make an argument about that, which you may share, may not, you may have different views about that, is that if we expand our view of the Caribbean in the ways that we're going to show in a moment, that objective of transforming the educational and communication system is going to assume a Caribbean that is Spanish-speaking, that is French-speaking, and not only that, that engages transformations of migrations of peoples beyond the Caribbean who then come back to the Caribbean with an English that is very different from the English that may be in Trinidad, maybe in Jamaica, and they come even from the United States, and that has to be engaged as well. Third objective of the Common Sense Convois that we are emphasizing is bringing the peoples of the Caribbean to the center of the political process. Well, which Caribbean are we talking about? Is it only or primarily the island Caribbean? Is it primarily the Anglo-speaking Caribbean? And if so, what are the implications of that? You or anyone else, or many people may say, yes, it is the English-speaking Caribbean, the island Caribbean. That's a legitimate case, but it has implications in terms of where we go in the 50 years from now. A fourth objective that we felt important to address in our presentation, and it says here, heightening the communion among people who love and value the Caribbean. I love and value the Caribbean, but I love and value a Caribbean that is English-speaking. I speak English as my second language, pero mi primer idioma también es el español. Yo comencé a hablar español como mi primer idioma, y me imagino que hay algunos aquí que hablan español, ¿verdad? However, I think that there's Caribbeanness in English and in Spanish and in French. I know you know that. I'm not suggesting that somehow you don't know that. I think that what I'm trying to emphasize is that sometimes because of our language issues, because of the way we see geography, when we're thinking about the future of the Caribbean, and sometimes the history for that matter, we don't see beyond the narrowness of some things, and we want to show some things about this in a moment. And finally, the fifth objective that we want to address in this presentation is the following. It says here, enhancing the self-knowledge and cultural confidence of Caribbean people as a unique civilization capable of dealing with the world on their own terms. I agree with that. The question I'm posing to you, again, in the spirit of Mr. Riley's statement about the jazz mind, is open your mind to think about this Caribbean, for example. You want to put the circle? All right. If you look at this map, there's a circle around an island Caribbean that is only Spanish-speaking, right? Here's Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. That's one version of the Caribbean. But obviously that island Caribbean excludes, through language, Trinidad, it excludes Jamaica, it excludes Belize, it excludes English-speaking peoples in Costa Rica and Honduras, and in various other places. And I think we should think about that when we think about not only the 5 objectives that I identified, but all the objectives of the convoy. The Caribbean that I'd like to propose to you that we think about is this Caribbean. And it's a proposition, a point of discussion. It is a Caribbean that is transnational, that is trans-language, that is trans-geographical, but has as a core a number of elements that Professor Best outlined in much of his writing that the Lloyd Best Institute champions. One of them is the plantation economy. The plantation economy was common to many regions of the Caribbean, understood in this broad dimension. However, another element that Professor Best emphasized is that plantation economy was based on the Atlantic slave trade. Yes? And so that immediately tells us that we're also talking about the history of the African diaspora. However, the African diaspora in a place like Central America is very different than the African diaspora in a place like Trinidad or Puerto Rico, because here there was very little plantation slavery. Not only that, you have a majority indigenous population. It is not the Indians from India, like here. It's a whole different kind of Indians. And that matters for thinking about the African diaspora population within an enlarged Caribbean. So, for example, if we consider those elements to be factual, and I personally think that they are, then what I urge you to do, and I urge this audience, and we're going to try to show you technologies by which we can address these questions, is to think of a Caribbean in the following typology. First of all, a Caribbean that includes diaspora and non-plantation-based Afro-descendant populations in the following countries: Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, y Guatemala, Spanish-speaking primarily. Not only that, an Afro-descendant population in Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that is Garifuna, an Afro-descendant population who is a mixture of peoples deported from St. Vincent to Honduras, who don't see themselves in many of the parameters by which sometimes the Caribbean is defined. A second part of the topology that I'm talking about is a Caribbean that includes the northern tier of South America, Colombia y Venezuela. That's also part of a redefined Caribbean. However, their relationship to the Americas is from the Andes. And the Andes is a very different world, yeah? And that must be understood. To be an Afro-descendant in Peru and in Ecuador is a very different thing. Now, there's enough commonality, however, that it can be included in an expanded view of the Caribbean. And a third, and this is probably the most possibly controversial, although there's lots of new historical writing and contemporary anthropological work on this, is a Caribbean that includes what is today eastern Texas, Louisiana, and much of Florida. You have Afro-descendant populations, New Orleans, for example, where I learned English. That's where I learned English. I went to high school in New Orleans. You could think of New Orleans as a Caribbean place, right? Yeah? If you redefine your notion of the Caribbean, you can certainly think of New Orleans as a Caribbean place. I'm asking you to do that. You might not agree with me, but I'm asking you to do that in the context of Mr. Riley's proposition. So, that's our proposition, a redefined Caribbean, and hence those objectives mean different strategies with which to accomplish them. What we're going to do now, and I'm going to give it off to Pablo, is he's going to offer some ideas through various technologies of how to begin to think about that.
So one idea then is how to cope with language and how to get beyond language and how to embrace language. You can't hear? So one idea is how to get beyond language, how to embrace language, how to work with language. And I'd like to cite some of the ideas that were brought up earlier. The question, how do you break through the wall between academia and the masses? Well, how do you break through the wall between each other, between our own islands and the mainland and this redefined Caribbean? How do you cope with illiteracy? How do you deal with new, and we would propose that you use a language that's universal, and that is a language of art, particularly visual language. And I'd like to share with you some examples of how this has been accomplished in the past, all the way back to the middle of the 20th century. Anyone know where this is? This is the Caribbean. It could be any island. Sugar. It happens to be Puerto Rico, which shared something with Honduras in the sense of a plantation economy, although it was sugar in Puerto Rico and bananas. United Fruit Company in Honduras. In Puerto Rico, of course, it was sugar, American sugar companies. The example I'd like to cite, the first example, comes from the time of Luis Muñoz Marín, the first elected governor, who ran under this logo, this slogan, "Vergüenza contra dinero," which is loosely translated as self-respect instead of money. And you can see the logo of the Popular Democratic Party, who was a jíbaro, a peasant. Muñoz was an outside-the-box thinker, and one of the things that he engaged was this idea of how to resolve some of the internal problems of the island by thinking outside the box, by thinking innovatively. And he engaged the intellectuals of the country and the artists who came together and came up with a plan to use the arts, to use graphic arts, book publication, films in a way that would reach all across the country. The technology was silkscreen, low tech, not a printing press, not an offset printing press because that was too expensive, but there was the labor to run silkscreen, which resulted in an enormous, today, artistic tradition of silkscreen. And here's a very early government-sponsored silkscreen urging people to vote. The vote that decides the elections can be yours, yours, yours. And you can see from the icons, the pictographs, that someone who was illiterate could understand this. Now, these are examples from the middle of the 20th century. The program is one of education. Everything done is measured in these terms. Specifically, I'd like to look at the second paragraph, where it talks about this approach of this government institution called the Division of Community Education, which is, in practice, this will mean giving to the community the wish, the tendency, and the way of making use of its own aptitudes for the solution of many of its own problems of health, education, cooperation, social life, through the action of the community itself. So at a grassroots level, it was important, the community was engaged. Some of the early graphics were aimed at issues of public health, danger, flies bring germs, bury your garbage and cover your foods. Posters like this were printed by the thousands and put up all over the countryside, and they had an effect. There was a decrease in malnutrition. Another poster urged people to boil their drinking water in order to avoid dysentery and germs. The film program was another very important part of this initiative, where for the first time films were made using local actors that addressed local issues, and they were shown in the countryside. Including a film, again, about the question of water. It's one thing to tell someone to boil your drinking water because there are germs in it. It's another thing when you show them visually by putting the camera through a microscope and showing them what these horrible germs look like, terrible monsters swimming around, and then, of course, after the water's boiled, their monsters are dead. As the program progressed, the issues became somewhat more lofty. This was a film that was made by the government in the 1940s to address the issue of manual labor, the dignity of manual labor, to promote the idea that manual labor was not something to be ashamed of. It was dignified to work with your hands. The government produced books to inform people, basic education, de cómo llegaron a Puerto Rico la caña, el café, el tabaco, y muchas otras cosas, about how these crops, sugar, coffee, tobacco, arrived in Puerto Rico, where they came from. Books about basic human rights. And later on in the 70s, a book urging people to conserve trees, not to cut their trees down, because trees are important for the environment. Without trees, you have flooding and you have drought, and a very simple pictographic use here of images showing that if you retain the trees, you'll have a green island. If not, you have a dry, hot island. Right, protect our trees. So this is an image from Puerto Rico from the 1940s, and of course this is a much more modern image. So these programs did have impact. There are problems as well today in these housing developments, but there is a basic level of subsistence. There's no rampant starvation the way there was. We'd like to jump ahead now to the present and talk about the use of modern digital technologies, in particular a digital encyclopedia about the Caribbean. It's very exciting. It's being produced, and I think I can skip to the actual digital online version. Why don't you come up and talk while I find the...
Yeah, what Pablo is going to show you briefly here is a digital encyclopedia that is being produced from the Dominican Republic and Cuba that is geared towards the general public about the history, culture, music, politics of the Caribbean. But guess what Caribbean the encyclopedia is talking about? First of all, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So Trinidad is not in this encyclopedia. And Jamaica is not in this encyclopedia. Right? So it is narrow in its view from my point of view, although I'm involved in the Central America part of it, right? But to me, I'm a critic of the same project that I'm involved in, right? Because it's narrowly Spanish-based. Second of all, it's Cuba, Cuba, Dominican Republic, right? And so it starts from an island-based Caribbean. It did move to Central America, but it took some time. And one of the things that I've been proposing to the organizers is that from the outset, a digital encyclopedia that, as we'll see in a moment, that engages all kinds of new technologies, film, music, that is very versatile, that is free, that you can use in your classrooms. For example, there was a teacher, I think she's over there getting some coffee, mentioned about the possibility or the need to involve teachers in this process of the Convois. Well, here's a great tool. However, it's in Spanish. Right? So that's one of the problems with it. So, for example, here's something you can access, and this is about music. Right? So it's got wonderful old music. You could use it to teach, right? And it's for right now. It's for the Dominican Republic, Panama. So you can plug in 2 images. It's a Cuban singer in this case. My point is that what I envision and what we're proposing in this Mind Jazz way of thinking that we were offered is for all of us, whatever version of the Caribbean we might have in our mind, to expand beyond that one. And that there are new technologies. We showed some, we have others, but we don't want to create obstacles for the book presentation. To think about a Caribbean that is tripartite in the way I mentioned, and that the new technologies allow us to do this. Here's a case from Trinidad itself. Pete the Pan Stick and you. You'll see it in a moment.
It's an online tool for learning how to play pan, developed by Simeon Standiford of Sanch Electronics here in Trinidad. Just waiting for the main screen to come up, because in addition to learning how to play pan, it has pan history, it has movies, all sorts of extraordinary richness in this program. But again, it's only in English.